Good morning and welcome to our live portion of this 2020 AD Layman Swine Conference. We've already had 2 days of pre-conference workshops as well as a poster session sponsored by BI last night. We want to thank BI for the support for this conference, but also for Second Harvest. For those who want to donate to this important endeavor, there is a button on our main page. We want to thank all the sponsors for the support for this conference, and we urge you to visit them at their virtual hall and also play the sponsor word scramble while there. Be sure to visit the flu clinic and take the flu vaccine pledge. We want to welcome back you who are previous attendees. We miss being together on the banks of the Mississippi, enjoying the classic September weather of the Layman Conference, and we have it once again. We look forward to doing that again, but we want to also take advantage to the special opportunities of this online meeting. Remember the chat function beside your presentation. Here's where questions can be asked to the speakers and where further discussions can occur. All workshops, posters, and breakouts are going to be available for review during this conference and later until February 2021. And so you don't have to make the difficult choices of which breakout to attend, and you can check past content as your schedule allows. We also want to welcome you who are first-timers. We hope it's not the last time that you join us, and we hope that you can join us in person in St. Paul in the future. The Layman Conference aim is to be as current as possible to address the challenges of our industry. 2020 is, by any measure, an extraordinary year. COVID-19, trade disruptions, and the ongoing spread of African swine fever have all contributed to making this year a source of incredible stress to the swine industry and a challenge to make real changes in our community. To start this discussion, we're honored to welcome back Mark Greenwood. Mark is Chief Diversified Markets Officer at Compure Financial. He serves on the organization's Asset Liability Committee. Mark graduated from Minnesota State University with a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration and a minor in economics. He joined Farm Credit in 1997. He's a knowledgeable leader within the farm credit system. He has given presentations throughout the United States, South America, Europe, and Canada on these economic issues in the protein sector. He was born and raised on a farm in southern Minnesota and has been involved in agriculture for his entire business career. He's a member of Pork Producers, Minnesota Corn Growers, Minnesota Soybean Association, and the Green Cme Business Group. He's an avid Minnesota Vikings fan, condolences there, and enjoys watching sports and reading. He's a runner, loves to run 10K races, and loves to spend time with his grandkids. We welcome you, Mark, to this virtual stage and look forward to your presentation.
All right. Hey, everybody. John, thank you for the introduction. I think I'm going to need to change my biography, John. I'm not sure if I'm any longer a Vikings fan after watching the last 2 weeks. So I think I'll just say I'm an avid sports fan. We'll call it a day. So if we can pull up the presentation, that would be great. And I would, first of all, I want to thank the Layman Group for inviting me back. We're absolutely under some interesting times. I think, John, when you asked me to speak, I think the first of all, our topic was, how did we get into this mess? And I said, no, that probably is not appropriate. So we came up with this title, Where Have We Been and Where Should We Go? And I think that's kind of where the mindset of the industry is at today. So let's go to the next slide. Are we at a crossroads? I don't know, but I think all of us are thinking about, especially after this year, which way should we potentially go as an industry? Let's go to the next slide. And especially since March, what have we learned during COVID? I think all of us have experienced stuff that, and especially all of us that are probably over the age of 50, we thought we've seen everything. We saw some stuff this year that I thought we never would see. I would say many of us would say that we'd hope we never see it again. Let's go to the next slide. And if you're in the protein sector, especially, and those of you that live in a community, I don't know how many of you got pinged in April and May and saying, you got to be kidding me. We're euthanizing animals and we're also have no meat in the shelves. And how frustrated were you as a producer as you're dealing with this? Whether you're in the processing side or the live side, these were very difficult times. Let's go to the next slide. And this, I think for us, this is kind of a progressional slide as we look at the industry overall. You look at production, we can understand that very, very well. And we're very, very good at it. I think the layman conference in general, when we talk about production, we continue to strive to get better every day in how we look at production and getting better at it. Now, during COVID, we had some things that we actually went through where we put pigs on diets where we're trying to get them to not gain weight, which in our career, we've never been able to have a witness before. But then I also want us to think about the consumer, and that is our customer, and how we serve the marketplace and how do we interact with that consumer up the food chain so they get a better understanding and they actually eat more of our product. Let's go on to the next diversion of this slide. And I think what COVID exposed to us, and this is really the theme of the presentation overall, is how do we become more agile? How do we become more innovative as an industry, not just as producers, on how we make sure that we innovate, we become agile as an industry. Let's go to the next slide. It's a little bit of a history reference here. This is a black and white, needless to say, old slide of actually it's probably the earliest picture I can remember that I've seen in my archives of my dad and myself. I was the youngest of three boys. My dad, probably at this age, built a new hog barn. And the reason why he did that is hogs help pay the bills on the farm, and it provided us a great way of life. And he always talked about that, grain was okay. But if I looked at what built and put our three boys through college, it was the swine industry, and it was raising hogs. Let's go to the next slide. I actually started my career back in my ag career after growing up on the farm with Cargill. And we had these Cargill open fronts, and we thought these were new and innovative back in the 80s. Being born and raised in Minnesota, and you have a 30 below wind chill day in January, these you started learning very quickly, weren't overly innovative, and we converted those to something far different. Let's go to the next slide. And we look at where we're at today with modern pork production, where if you look at large farm facilities, it seems like economies of scale is larger sow units that have where we're weaning more pigs per week has a sense of being where we need to be going forward. Let's go to the next slide. We also had visionaries in the early 90s. Those of you, whether you're not quite as old as someone like myself, or you may be from a foreign country, this is Wendell Murphy. Wendell Murphy in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, really revolutionized, especially the East Coast production, and really talked about 3-stage production and more pigs in confinement. And so Wendell was a visionary and really started developing what the U.S. pork industry became. Let's go to the next slide. And then our dear friend Bob Christensen. Bob, really, when you look at Minnesota pork production per se, and you look at Midwest pork production, Bob took the ideas that he learned from North Carolina and then brought them into the Minnesota. And when we looked at a lot of our building in the 90s and early 2000s, a lot of that came from Bob's vision and ideas. In addition to that, the other thing that Bob actually did, he said, hey, I need to think about integration and how I become really part of the overall chain going forward. And so the building of Triumph Foods and his, as they continued to grow that business, integration really became part of what he saw as being successful in the pork industry. Let's go to the next slide. I also look at the vet community and what we've been able to develop in the industry overall. As we continue to really look at our production and our production practices, whether it's animal welfare, making sure antibiotic use, disease prevention, keeping foreign animal disease out, as John alluded to about ASF, we've continued to do a very good job on doing the right thing on behalf of the industry. And I would say the vet community in general has done an extraordinary job there. And we have to keep our eye on the ball to make sure that we look at diseases of ASF or other foreign animal diseases that would especially impact export markets is very important on how we continue to be successful going forward. Let's go to the next slide. The other thing I look at Dr. Morrison's the shrimp project. You have this collaboration of all these large producers where they're actually working together and sharing information of health statuses, what's actually happening on their farm, to making sure that we're doing the right thing from a production standpoint to make sure that we're continuing to get better as an industry. Let's go to the next slide. These are what we see on the best of the best on production benchmarks. We have many new sow units that are running over 30 PS pigs per sow per year. Many larger systems, what we see greater than 40 to 50,000 are running at 26 to 27. We do have some larger systems that are over 40 to 50,000 sows today that are at their entire operation that are running at over 30. So there is capability of getting even more production efficiencies out of larger systems. When you look at mortality, nursery and finishing, the best of the best are running at under 2%. When we look at grade A pigs, and I'm sure this audience understands that, we're selling grade A pigs at 94%. Now that was all done pre-COVID. I fundamentally believe we'll get back to that. When we had COVID, I think there's some things that we were doing that we probably saw mortality, and I'll address that in a couple of slides coming up. When I look at just overall numbers going forward. We have, in the US, we had 6.3 million sows. How many do we actually need as we continue to improve production? My plain and simple answer is not 6.3 million. This industry production efficiency is not our problem. Well, in fact, I'm gonna maybe a counter argument to that. Well, maybe it is. Maybe we're just really good at production, but we also have to understand what happens to our overall supply as well. Let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to take a quick drink before I cough on everybody, so please bear with me. If you look at what happened with our harvest capacity as we go forward, and the blue line really looks at what happened in 2020, where we actually went to about 60% capacity. And the yellow line is when you looked at 2019. We've actually been able to catch up, and that's a testament to the processing side. Now, there's a couple things that I think I really want us to focus on this slide. Is we're getting the pigs harvested, but if you talk to anybody in the processing side, we're not getting further processing done, whether it's deboning hams and all that further processing that actually helps our overall cutout value. And I perfectly understand that cutout value has come up the last couple of weeks, which is great to see, but we're still short on labor on the processing side, and we're not extrapolating full value on those pigs. I also want to talk about the yellow slide, and I think this is the number that I think many of us discuss on, okay, we know what we had for 2019. We had record harvest weekly numbers for all of 2019. I can also tell you when we had our discussions as a swine group at Capir, and that our swine team does a tremendous job on working with their clients, the one thing that we would stress is we knew for sure the first quarter of 2020 that we thought we were going to have more pigs coming the fourth quarter of 2020. Now, what happened during COVID, I think this is the gray area that I think all of us don't know. And I know there's a lot of people saying, hey, we're going to have more pigs backed up the fourth quarter of 2020. I'll be honest with you, I honestly don't know if that's accurate or not. And the reason why I always say this, and I want us to be cautious as an industry, that I think when we did any type of euthanizing an animal, or we did a more proactive, I call it culling on weaning pigs, that occurred really in that March, April, and May timeline. So and in addition to that, if you were selling a weaned pig in April, you probably had a zero value. So you very well probably maybe gave that pig away, or you maybe euthanized that animal. I actually think we're probably gonna get pigs harvested in the fourth quarter of this year. I'm not sure if we're gonna get backed up. That's my hope. I also want us to be making sure that we're thinking proactively about what could happen in 2021, where I call it's a reverberation, where if all of a sudden cutout continues to stay at a pretty good level, I know how this industry reacts, and I know how quickly this industry can react to increasing more pigs. I'm worried about supply as we look forward into 2021, because if all of a sudden we look at June and July futures of next year over $80, there's margin there. We're going to save every pig possible. So I'm telling you that we actually might be okay with supply for the fourth quarter of this year, but I'm also worried about what we might do on the farm going forward into 2021. So let's not get overly confident that we have this all figured out. Let's go to the next slide. So the current state of the industry, and I think all of us, especially in 2020, we just want it to stop. This has been a tough year for everybody. Let's go to the next slide. I also tell you from a lender standpoint, I think it's going to be a fight. I think people are waiting for others to concede. I would say prior to the run-up, I think people are saying, well, okay, there's going to be all this tremendous liquidation. I'm telling you, the industry is consolidated to a point where the majority of the industry is all in. Top 40 represent close to 70% of the industry. Smaller producers aren't enough to move the needle to really reduce supply. In addition to that, with what they have gotten for CFAP aid, and now you have CFAP number 2, they're actually going to hold their own very well. So what should we think about changing? More on that later, but let's look at some data. Let's go to the next slide. This is their database, spans across here, clear across the US, many different production models, represents about 20% of the industry, and sales processors all over the US. This really looks at, this is more graphical terms from 2014 to 2020, Q1 results. Let's go to the next slide. This just looks at balance sheets, and this, what I'll basically tell you is what we've seen overall is we've seen owner equity stay at a pretty darn good level, which is the green line. We're still sitting at sitting at over 60% gap owner equity, which is a conservative number. When we look at working capital per sow, we're actually at a higher number, and that's really current assets minus current liabilities. We have more liquidity in our industry today than what we had the first quarter of 2019. Reason for that is first quarter of 2019, we had a little thing called margin calls. We had a little run up on hog futures. This industry, the people that are left in it that are non-integrated do a tremendous job of risk management, and they're very proactive on risk management. So we're funding a fair amount of margin calls. Overall, I will clearly tell you, when you look at this number, we're still sitting at numbers at over $800 of working capital per sow. When I call it our underwriting guidelines really look at $400 to $500 of working capital per sow, we're in a very good shape from a working capital trend. So what I'm telling you is there's a lot of liquidity and a fair amount of staying power going forward. Let's go to the next slide. If you look at operational profit, and this is a little bit of the blue looks at livestock revenue, and you look at overall cost of production. Most producers, if you look at the overall revenue, didn't make a lot of money. If we look at operational cost of production, what we've seen is cost of production first quarter of 2019 sitting at about $69 per hundredweight. Probably have some people from Iowa State on this call. They have their model. We believe that's a little bit too good. When we look at total cost of production, what we see at overall cost of production is probably at $68 to $69 per hundredweight. Probably see it come down a bit because we had cheaper corn costs. We'd say the best of the best would probably be in the mid 60s. Let's go to the next slide. With this chart, we'll show you though, is if you look at the lighter green one, there's a little thing called hedge profit gain or loss. And if you go back to the previous slide, and you don't need to do that, but where our producers have made money the last 5 years is either one of two things. Either you're integrated or you've done a very good job of hedging. If we look at, especially in 2020, every part of our profit has been through hedge gains. And we've seen a lot of producers have done it, and you got Bill McBean on this presentation. Bill's group does a very good job, and there's a lot of good firms, but the producers left are doing a very good job of risk management going forward. And they had a lot of coverage through about August of this year. And I can clearly tell you in the last couple of weeks, they've been aggressive again on taking risk management going forward through about April to minimize some potential losses. Let's go to the next slide. The other thing I'll tell you is our overall loan volume has not moved much since March 1st. If we look at our revolving lines of credit, we've stayed at about 36% usage, and that hasn't changed much since March. I'm going to go to the last point. When we build plants, we have a tendency, it's kind of like building the field of dreams. We'll build it and they're going to come. And by the way, I did presentations 2 or 3 years ago about adding packing plants. I said, we're going to add production, because if you're on the processing side, you also want to make sure we're going to keep those plants full. And we're running at flat out top speed on operational efficiency. And we did get exposed during COVID. The question I think the industry really needs to ask is, what is the proper level of production? Let's go to the next slide. I think I missed a slide, and very well, I probably did that. I think the pork board, Jana, did we click? Can you go back? And if we missed it, nope. Well, never mind. There was a slide that the pork board had. Oh, I messed it up. Let's keep going. So this is operator error, and when you do so many conferences, this is on me. So I'm going to talk about where should we go as an industry, and I think this is really the closing part where I think the industry should really think about. Let's go to the next slide. This is National Pork Board put this together and talked about, and they asked consumers about where, from a protein perspective, where does pork rank? The left is the strongest part, the right is the least part. So tastes good, good for me, my family, easy preparation. You know, it fits into my daily routine. It's versatile. The protein is versatile and good for the planet. If you look at pork, we ranked 4th or dead last when it came for good for me and my family. And that slide that I said, oh, is the point blame. I looked at the slide probably about 60 days ago. We had a webinar with Angie Krieger, who works for the National Pork Board, and she's really working with the consumer side of things. We looked at this initially. The pork industry is a very competitive industry. When I look at this slide, we're absolutely, when we look at where our customers view us, we're getting our butts kicked, plain and simple. And I think we continue to focus on operational efficiencies and making sure we produce as much pounds of pork as we possibly can. But if we don't start focusing on this, we're going to have a problem. We do have a problem. Let's go to the next slide. Again, we look at COVID, we were focused on one thing. We're focused on production, production, production. In addition to that, we're focused on throughput in our plants, and we weren't nimble enough. And I understand it's a fresh product, but we did get exposed. Let's go to the next slide. And if you look at, there's multiple articles on this, on supply chain management and how COVID is disrupting the nation's food chain. Is it going to get disrupted again this winter? I don't know. But if we haven't learned some things about what we need to do to make sure that this doesn't happen again, we've missed an opportunity. And I think that's the point that I want all of us to think about as we go forward. Let's go to the next slide. Without exports, we'd have fundamentally 2 different things. We'd have a far less supply in the United States. And if we weren't exporting our products today, and by the way, if it wouldn't be for China this year, we'd have even far lower prices going forward. I think the US is very well positioned to keep growing our export model. But with that does come some risk. Let's go to the next slide. And I will clearly tell you, if you're a producer that's not integrated, and if you look at the red line being cutout and the green line being negotiated price, you're going to look at, how do I get up? How do I stay successful long term? Or do I need to get integrated to make sure I can be viable long term? Understand cutouts at $87, but the cash market today is at 60. We're sitting at 70% cash to cutout. That you cannot survive on that big of a gap. I'm probably not making everybody happy on this one, but I can clearly tell you, if you're selling on a negotiated net price market, that is not a sustainable model as we look forward. And by the way, that gap has been pretty wide for almost the last 5 years. Look, the data will show that right there. Let's go to the next slide. In addition to that, we've seen further
we seem to have lost our speaker at this point.
Hey, John, I'm back.
Great. Welcome back.
So welcome to the world of virtual. When you get a phone call, and I got pinged. I apologize, everybody. So let's go back to the slide. Why not? Why not get a phone call? And by the way, it was a spam call as I got it, which you can't make up, of course, during 2020. The amount of Packer-owned share of total slaughter is also growing as well. So we've seen greater integration. Let's go to the next slide. The other thing that I think the industry also needs to understand is we're staying at about 50 to 51 pounds of pork consumed per person in the United States. The only reason why we've grown at all is population growth. we're not gaining market share. And if you look at the broiler sector, and by the way, I've been doing this for my entire career, really since I was in the feed business in 1980, and I worked for Farm Credit, as John alluded to, started in 1997. We had these discussions in 1997. We have not moved the needle at all. And I think there's part of it is, and I'll relate it to the Vikings. We have Kirk Cousins as our quarterback. We're not doing really well. And so we need to make some changes. So food for thought, not about the Vikings, but about the industry. Let's go to the next slide. And here's an example of innovation and I'm going to focus more on Purdue on the broiler sector. Purdue Farms also owns Nyman Ranch, but Purdue has been very active on the broiler sector where they've continued to gain some market share. They made a fairly bold move where now they have went online and direct from Purdue right to your doorstep. And if you go look at anybody right now, what we've seen is more and more people are shopping, especially groceries, online. So they've said, okay, instead of getting your groceries via online through an Albertsons, Hy-Vee, Cub Foods in the Midwest, by the way, you can go direct to that farm, the producers such as Purdue. And by the way, if you buy it from Purdue, their label will also tell you which farm that was grown on. Pretty interesting thought process of innovation. Let's go to the next slide. This is the interesting one with Dean Banks as being named the new CEO at Tyson. I don't know if many people are familiar with what his background was. If you look at Tyson's previous management team, almost all of them had a deep understanding of the protein industry. Mr. Banks' previous job was with another company called Google, which makes you think and pause about where they want to take their organization and how does someone that has a very little understanding of the protein side, but has a great understanding of, I call it data analytics and really thinking differently and maybe from a disruptive standpoint to make their organization different going forward. Just something to think about. Let's go to the next slide. And I got a couple closing comments, John, and then I think we'll open it up for questions. And this is for all of us. Do we want to repeat the same cycle? I've done this for the farm credit system since '97. I think this is my fourth or fifth cycle. I'm saying we have a tendency, 2014, we made a lot of money. And there's some people that were new to the industry. They kept going, why does everybody want to expand? We made just a lot of money. Well, that's just what we do. Well, do we think about what we actually want to do going forward? The other thing to think about, when you look at the existing ownership of the top 40, they all probably look like me. They've got gray hair, receding hairline. Will the next generation have the same mindset, or will they think differently? I think that's something really to think about as when you really start looking at the next 5 to 10 to 15 to 20 years. I think this is a question I get asked all the time. Do you integrate or exit? I don't know. I think it goes back to the next point. Do you need to collaborate more effectively with the entire supply chain? I say absolutely. Without question, we also need to be cost competitive. If we are dependent on exports, I'll clearly tell you we're going to have to be more, it's going to be more volatile as we continue, especially with revenue. You're going to have more volatility. Think about what happened with Germany. And if we would get ASF in the United States, what that would do to prices. And I happen to also sit on the Swine Health Information Center board. And that has been a wonderful opportunity for me to continue to learn. But I can tell you, when I start looking at what would happen to our industry if we would get it here, I shudder from a lender perspective. And this is the last point I want us to think about. Do we need to discuss supply management? And my question is, my answer to this is yes. And especially when we look at moments of COVID, and Bill McVean would have tremendous information because I get information from Bill. Bill could share with you what the broiler industry did when COVID hit. The Daily Livestock Report had a report what the turkey industry did. From an egg set perspective, they stopped hatching eggs. So they cut their supply for 4 weeks, just like that, by about 4%. I know we have all this Department of Justice regulations that are sitting out there, but you look at what amount of pain that caused this industry, and we were not nimble. I think we got to have greater discussion if we have these types of events, especially an issue with ASF. And by the way, we got, from a media perspective, we were not put into a positive light. And the industry needs to have an open discussion about how you discuss supply management during times of a pandemic or any type of foreign animal disease. Just something for this industry to think about. Let's go to the next slide. 2 closing thoughts. Because the people are not crazy enough to think about they can change the world, are the ones that actually do. The industry has done a marvelous job when it comes to production management. But I think what we need to think about is what we do next going forward as an industry. I challenge this industry to think differently about how we make it better going forward. And again, think different. Let's go to the next slide. And I miss our dear friend, Bob. I always love having conversations with Bob. Bob was one of those wonderful individuals. And I think the one great attribute or character that Bob had that probably all of us enjoyed more than anybody was he was a tremendous listener. He didn't talk as much, but he asked these questions to get your point of view. And I think if I can get the industry to do one thing, is to do more what Bob Morrison would do for the industry. He would ask questions, he would listen before he would act. And I think we need that more than ever as I look at the pork industry going forward. So with that, John, thank you all.
Thank you, Mark. And we'd like to listen to you a bit more on some of those areas that you brought forward. And a number of questions are coming forward, but I'll start with one myself. I'll reveal that I have less hair and it's maybe even a bit more gray than yours. And I've seen a few more hog cycles growing up, remembering my first in the 60s. But I'll also reveal that I'm a Canadian and I'm a bit more comfortable with supply management than
Yep.
some of my American brethren. What do we need to do to start cracking eggs like the poultry industry has? You mentioned we did it already, probably in April,
Yep.
But what do we need to do to start considering that aspect?
John, I'll be perfectly candid. It is one of the greatest frustrations that I have with the industry. We had a peer group with a whole bunch of producers that we talk about from an operational perspective. And we're trying to get producers to share on what they were doing on handling euthanizing pigs. It was like I was in a room of silence and the crickets were chirping. No one really wanted to discuss that because I actually believe they're worried about being sued by DOJ on supply chain management. I'm saying, wait a minute. We have to be willing to at least open that door now going forward to think about that. Because in the discussions that the amount of phone calls that our swine team and I was getting during that time was off the charts. But I'm saying, but they were having one-on-one. And I'm saying, if you're a packer and you're a producer and we're not having any of this conversation, we have a mess. We created a mess. So I go back to, hey, by the way, the broiler industry, they have 40 companies that control 85% of the industry. They just publicly said, this is what we're doing. And they ain't getting any trouble. And I'm saying, okay, I'm going to test what our current state is today. Because our current state today, when we look at supply chain management, especially if we have disruptions, causes a severe problem for this industry.
Sort of a question along the same line on that aspect is that the poultry industry treats live production as a cost center rather than as a profit center. Is that part of the inducement as well?
Yeah, I think it is, John, because they're vertically integrated. I mean, and are we going like a chicken or like the broiler sector? Probably are, but can it be more coordinated as we go forward? I think you're going to have to. And I hate to bring up the point of the negotiated market, but if you're going to come to us and say, okay, we're going to build a brand new sow unit and we're going to sell pigs on a negotiated market, we're going to say, are you really, is that a good decision for you to spend money that way? It has to be in a more coordinated manner.
Does coordination mean less agility? I think you infer that in some concerns about the poultry industry.
Yeah. John, I think if you're more coordinated, it should give you the ability to be more agile in addressing supply. And also, when you look at, John, I'll be honest with you, and everybody on the call or the virtual webinar here, I don't like our consumption is flatline, and we're not. And I think we have producers producing and we have processors processing. In the broiler sector, which has gotten integrated, has continued to gain market share. So I'm saying, okay, but we do have a fair amount of our processing side is more integrated. What do we? I do think we need to take a pause and look and say, okay, how do we need to innovate so our actual customer wants more of our product?
And do you have any suggestions? It's one of the questions. I think it's something to think about, the further processing rather than simply killing a pig.
Yep.
What are the things that we can do within pork production to support further processing?
Well, and I'm not an expert on that, but this is just food for thought. Do you need to have more, I call it specialization, where you have producers produce and processors just harvest, and then you have another group that just, you look at the Oscar Mayers of the world, that they basically got out of the harvesting, where they became further processing, and they developed more of those brands and those products along the way. Is that something the industry should potentially consider? You look at, I look at what Costco has done on building a broiler processing plant in Fremont, Nebraska, where they just bypassed everybody and said, we're just going to raise our own birds. I do believe that I think and I think this is the other thing. If I'm a packer, I think you are going to see somebody somewhere along the way is going to say, okay, how do I make that leap where I'm just going to go direct? Think about Amazon. I don't know what that is, but I think having those types of ideas or models is good for the industry to think about.
Another question that came up is, where should slack capacity occur within the system? Should it be in production, in slaughter, in further processing? In other words, we will have ups and downs in the industry. Do we need to design beyond efficiency?
Well, if you'd ask any of the people that are involved in all those, John, they'd say, well, as long as it's not on mine, I'm good with this decision. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Yep.
I actually believe it probably needs to be on the harvesting side. And I can hear my phone's going to start ringing, and so they're going to delete me now. But if we're running at 90 to 95%, I think we're going to have, especially if we're running large double shifted plants, and they've done a very good job of harvesting those animals. How do we, and they also have to, I'm sure they're addressing this as well. Okay, what happens if this happens again? Because if it happens to the live side, and you don't shoot the messenger, but I'm telling you, if you're providing capital to the live side, and all of a sudden we had producers that had hedges on in June that had $90 hedges, but they also had to euthanize animals. I don't want that to happen again.
Exactly. And it seemed like those producers in some ways were particularly exposed with marginal
Absolutely.
production.
Yep, that's exactly right.
And it seems like the slack capacity ended up occurring within production
It did.
with slowing down pigs, and
Yep.
to be able to handle that aspect with some concerns about the welfare of the pigs as well, whether
Yep.
they need to be euthanized or otherwise. It seems that other markets have more extra capacity, either in housing capacity or in slaughter capacity. How do you induce that extra capacity?
Well, John, it's a great question, and through the experience of COVID, biologically, pigs, we're producing pigs all the time, especially on the south side. And I think the biggest discussions that we had with producers was from a labor standpoint, how do you, the last thing you want to do is encourage your labor to, how do you euthanize a market animal? And that's more than difficult. We can probably do a little bit of that on the smaller end with, potentially aborting some sows, or, really doing a much better job on judiciously not weaning every pig. But still, the mindset of people that are taking care of their animals, that is just very difficult. And that's where I would always go back to looking at the coordination between the producer side and the processor side, that you have to understand both sides of the equation. If all of a sudden it falls back directly on that producer, from a lender standpoint, it makes that very difficult.
Another question that came up is, and we'll discuss it in more detail this morning, but do you have any lessons that we learned through this year so far that can be applied to African swine fever introduction?
I think this gave us a glimpse, and it's a very small glimpse of what this could do to the U.S. pork industry. I actually was on a SHIC call this morning at 6 a.m. with Paul. I think Paul's speaking right this week.
Yeah.
If all of a sudden we would get ASF here, and the people on the SHIC board have heard me, I'm saying, I can tell you from a lender's perspective, it would be ugly. And we have to be more diligent than we ever have to make sure that we do not have that disease get into this country, because it will materially change the industry. And by the way, we weren't prepared for this, right? And I think, I hate to tell you this, but I think I'd really be talking more on the live side. If we would get ASF here, what that would do to the live side, again, greater preparation. I know there's been some meetings that we had in September on doing scenarios. I think you got to keep working on those scenarios. and you got to communicate, and go back to what I talked about with Bob, what Bob would do. Bob would listen, and then we develop a plan.
Very fair. And had a question early on. Your allegory for Kirk Cousins was a fair allegory, except we need a better quarterback in swine production. How do you see that leadership and coordination developing?
Well, I think all of us are involved, and we all take ownership. Hey, I think all of us, especially and first of all, I have been blessed to be involved in this industry, and I love the people, first of all. I'm more than willing to have a discussion, and I think others need to have that open discussion. And I think the sooner that we can have those discussions, the better off we're going to be. If we continue to say, well, we're just going to go back to what we were, I think we're missing out on an opportunity.
Very fair. And another question that came up for your crystal ball: are you worried about a spike in COVID-19 causing some of the slowdowns in processing again?
Yes. Now, maybe we have enough herd immunity. I don't know. I always worry about what happens, kind of like PRRS, where we have this bounce back again, John, where all of a sudden we have another slowdown where people have more fear about coming back to work. And because we're struggling with labor as it is, that all of a sudden we get a slowdown. And by the way, if it happens in the wintertime and we have this same problem again, I think it'd even be more difficult than what we had in March, April, and May.
Very fair comments, and we had some discussion on simply supporting labor issues and providing protections for labor market, not only for current slaughter and processing, but for future expansion. So welcome that aspect as well. We are getting some comments saying that supply management is not a free market answer, and I think we begin the conversation here.
Well, and let me go back to, and I'm about free market. Where I'm at is if we get ASF and we get another COVID outbreak again, that's where we need to have the discussion. Because if business as usual, I have no problem with free market. Let me make my clarification. But if you have a COVID outbreak or an ASF outbreak and say, well, it's not my problem. No, it is our problem. And that's my challenge back to the industry, where you got to have those discussions. I've been through multiple discussions on sow buyout and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to go there, but I am going to challenge the industry. By the way, if all of a sudden you have a COVID outbreak, we're going to go back to what we're going to do again and say, well, I wasn't impacted, so it's not my problem. I think that is a poor response on behalf of the industry. And by the way, I'm willing to listen to that other point of view. I need to be more like Bob on that, but hey, I've got the platform, so I'm going to give my point of view on that right now.
Well, thanks a lot for your points of view and for your continued leadership in this industry. You've given us a lot to think about, not only during the coming years, but especially during this conference as we look at different opportunities to go forward. So thanks again, Mark.
You're welcome. I appreciate the opportunity, John. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks. Well, we began this conference with a discussion on some of the major challenges, especially financial challenges within this industry. To dig into a bit more on the financial challenges, we've invited Bill Kaelin from K&M Trading to join us as well. He's going to talk about the subject of price discovery in the hog market. As Mark mentioned, we have a situation right now that in many ways is unsustainable, and we need to find alternative methods within the market to support producers as they move forward. Bill has been watching pricing of hogs as well as other areas, especially within the livestock industry. K&M Trading is a commodity trading organization registered with the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. He was with McCain Trading and Investments from 91 till 2013. His primary focus is on research and trading in the agricultural markets, and as I mentioned, in livestock in general. Before this position, working with McBain Trading, he worked for Citicorp in the asset and liability management and corporate finance departments. He holds a bachelor's degree from Southern Methodist University, an MBA from the Owen Graduate School of Management at Vanderbilt. Bill's a member of the Beta Gamma Sigma Honorary Business Society, and we welcome you, Bill, and look forward to your discussion on this challenge as Mark laid out. Thanks.
Perfect. Hopefully we're in good shape on the slides and everything. John? I'm going to assume that's a yes. So let's start. First of all, I want to thank John for asking me to speak today, as well as the University of Minnesota and its partners and sponsors for putting together this year's Lehman's Conference in what is clearly a challenging environment. Through the years, this conference has been an important venue for swine industry participants to share information and discuss issues that the industry faces. The industry clearly this year is experiencing a gut check. More than ever, the sharing of this type of information is critical. So once again, I want to thank all the organizers for doing what it takes to put this together. So as John said, today I was asked to speak, generally speaking, on the issue of price discovery. As I said earlier, the industry is experiencing a significant gut check in terms of how it operates from top to bottom, frankly. I think while this issue of price discovery is not often on the top of most observers' lists of critical issues, I contend, and hopefully will build the case, that the lack of price discovery in today's hog and pork industry is causing issues that, frankly speaking, if they're left unchecked, they'll alter the way the industry looks and operates in the future in an irreparable way. I'm going to thank Mark for kind of opening the door on some of these issues. I didn't realize he would do that, and John for asking some questions around it. So some of what I'm going to say is going to dovetail off of what Mark said, but hopefully you'll find this useful. So let's see here if I can make this happen. Okay, so as an outline for today's discussion, I'm going to break my thoughts into 4 sections. Clearly, the general topic will be price discovery. I'm going to, what is price discovery? Secondly, do we have it in today's swine industry? Third, do we need it? Is it something that we even need? And then finally, I'll contend that in fact we do need it. So the answer is, the final issue would be, can we get it? I don't think this should take very long to make the point. So hopefully I can move through this pretty quickly and leave plenty of time for some questions and answers, because I do think this is an important issue the industry faces. So first of all, price discovery, what is it? If you ask 10 different people what price discovery was or is, you'd get 10 different answers. The one I think best sums it up is simply that price discovery is the process by which a fair market price is determined through interactions between buyers and sellers, ultimately matching supply and demand. Importantly, the price that results oftentimes is an important reference price for the market and industry in which the price discovery takes place. So importantly, I'd ask you as I move through this presentation to focus on these 3 key phrases within that definition. First of all, fair. Secondly, interactions between buyers and sellers. And then lastly, an important reference price for the market and industry. So let's see if I can get this going. So price discovery, do we have it? To me, the answer is pretty clear that within today's negotiated hog market, the answer is no. Mark alluded to this. It was nice to hear a lender of certainly his stature point out the obvious, and that is that the negotiated hog market, whether it be through thinness, through lack of fairness, fails to represent a fair value or price discovery for this industry. And so I'm going to try to address why that is the case. This is simply a chart of seasonally adjusted barrel and gilt slaughter. I just take out the seasonal variances just to see the general trend. And you can see here, despite a rapidly growing number of hogs being slaughtered in recent years, which would lead most to conclude that we have a very vibrant marketplace where price discovery could easily take place, I'm going to contend that there are two trends that have had a material impact on the inability of the negotiated market to thrive and provide a platform for price discovery. First, again, as this chart suggested, and Mark used this same chart, we have a growing number of hogs slaughtered in this country being in the hands of the packers themselves. In recent years, we've had several, as everyone knows, we've had several new packing plants built. And what I find interesting and in some cases disturbing as it relates to the price discovery issue is almost all of them have been in the hands of producer groups. Clearly, this chart says that all in, nearly 40% of the barrow and gilts that are slaughtered in today's market are in the hands of packers. And so by definition, these hogs don't transact in the open market. Second, as this chart indicates, within the shrinking percentage of producer-owned hogs that we still do slaughter, we now have a very small percentage of those hogs that are being transacted in the open market. If I put these two trends together, unfortunately, we see that we have an uninterrupted downtrend in the percentage of hogs that are slaughtered that fall under the negotiated category. And unfortunately, just to put an exclamation point on this issue, last week we saw a record low number of barrow and gilt slaughtered that came from the negotiated side of the market, and the percentage of the total that was slaughtered made a new low at less than 1%. Clearly, this market is broken, and again, I don't think it takes too much of a leap of faith to appreciate that price discovery is almost impossible to exist in a market that is this thin and represents this little a percentage of total all animals dying. So low volume is clearly not a good thing. However, I would argue that if that volume is still being done with a reasonably large number of buyers and sellers, at least it was tolerable. The situation in the negotiated hog market last year went from bad to worse. As this chart indicates, in late June and through big chunks of July of last year, not only was the volume in the key negotiated market low, but the number of transactions or traders in the negotiated market were so low that the USDA was unable to even report Western Corn Belt prices. And for a while prior to that, the Eastern Belt has struggled with these same issues. Specifically, the USDA had to make some changes. They stated specifically that the thinness in the negotiated market has made it increasingly difficult for the AMS to publish regional market information while maintaining the confidentiality requirements set forth in the statute. I think when we get to the point where the USDA is having a difficult time with that big of a difficult time actually releasing the information that of the negotiated market, to me, we've reached a point probably of no return. The thin borderline non-existent cash market is a serious problem for achieving price discovery. I mean, that should be obvious. An additional and probably related problem for the industry is that we are seeing an increasing divergence in the prices received by hog farmers. Historically, there's been a strong correlation between the prices received by farmers. You can clearly see in this chart that dating back, into the early part of 2003, upwards of 2013-14, there was a strong correlation that exists between all the categories of marketing agreements that the industry was using. Here recently, we've seen a divergence, in a meaningful divergence in that pattern. If I take a closer look at these prices, we can see that increasingly large gaps are opening up between the prices received depending on the marketing agreements. You can see that in the middle of the COVID situation, we had a negotiated market that was just under 30 cents, while there was chunks of the industry that were receiving over 60 bucks. Clearly, this is a situation where the industry is having a harder and harder time with discovering one price that speaks for the value of the livestock that the industry is now producing. Making matters worse, as this table shows, and I apologize if it's too small, but I think what this illustrates is that even within these individual price categories, we have a large dispersion between the average price and the median price that each category represents. The bottom line is this. This divergence in prices received means increasingly there's no common measure of value for the hogs sold today. Specifically, price discovery is simply not taking place on the hog side of the industry today. So I think I've built a case that, at least on the negotiated side of the hog market, we in fact don't have price discovery taking place today. So the question is, do we even need price discovery? To me, the answer is yes, and I think it's clearly yes, especially if we want an industry characterized by a large number of independent producers. Mark talked about the chicken industry and some of the things they've been able to do that the hog industry was unable to do during the COVID-related shutdown. Some of that certainly was a byproduct of integration. Some of it is simply a function of the relatively short life cycle that the chicken industry has relative to the pork and beef industry. But I think that the one thing is clear is that if we want an industry that is going to continue to be populated by a large number of independent producers, price discovery is vitally important to support that. So the hog market is still characterized, as I said, by a large number of independent producers. On the other hand, we have a chicken industry that in the United States is mostly contract growers. So why is this? Well, there are a number of reasons these two meat industries have so far gone in different directions. I will contend that there are two requirements an industry needs if it's going to be characterized by independent producers versus contract growers. The first one is clear and transparent transaction price for livestock. Clearly, if we're going to have independent producers, we need to have a price that those independent producers can market their livestock with the packing community. But I think another one that doesn't probably get as much attention, and certainly it was nice to hear Mark talk about some of these things, is that access to independent capital and effective risk management tools are vitally important for an industry that is going to be characterized by independent producers. It's going to be very difficult without risk management to convince the Mark Greenwoods of the world that they should make capital available to an independent producer. And so I think, again, to me, the two requirements, if we want this industry to continue to be populated by independent producers, these are two of the vitally important components that we need to have characterize the industry. Like I said, there are many variables at work, but I would suggest that the lack of price discovery and the lack of a clear and consistent and common price for hogs transacted today has been a strong driver of the historic trend that Mark pointed out towards a larger and larger percentage of hogs being in the hands of the packers themselves. So pretty clear to me that number one, we do not have price discovery in the negotiated side of the hog industry today. Secondly, it's pretty clear to me that if we want this industry to be characterized by large numbers of independent producers, it's just vital that we do find a way to discover price and value within the industry. So I believe that the industry does need a common price or measure of value that can be established, and economic signals can be sent in a clear, consistent, transparent manner. I believe the answer is can we get it? I think the answer is yes. I think in some ways we already have it. And I believe the best candidate to fill that role in today's swine industry is the negotiated pork cutout. While wholesale pork cutout prices have been reported for many years, importantly, starting in 2013, the USDA has been reporting on a daily basis the value of the wholesale pork cutout under a mandatory price reporting mandate. The mandatory reporting mandate is a vital component to the cutout becoming a transparent and trusted measure of value. You know, without the when it was voluntary, there was all sorts of representation issues that I think may have stood in the way of the cutout becoming the key metric for price discovery in today's industry. But I think given that it's been a mandatory requirement for the industry since 2013, should put some of those concerns to rest. Over this period of time, while the cutout's been mandatory, you can see here in this slide that the amount traded, while having a significant amount of variability on a day-to-day basis, has overall remained stable. Let's see, next slide here. Again, and importantly, the volume traded in the pork cutout when compared to the negotiated hog market is substantially larger. This slide clearly, it shows the cutout volume in the negotiated market is the yellow line, and the negotiated hogs are the blue line. And you can see that here recently, it's been the pork cutout, the amount traded is 6 to 7 times as large as the negotiated hog market. Also important is the negotiated pork cutout represents nearly 25% of all the pork that transacts. And again, this is a substantial contrast to the less than 1% that the negotiated hog market represents of hogs that are slaughtered today. Finally, and probably importantly, I will add that when one considers that over 35% of the hogs slaughtered today are now in the hands of packers themselves, and that a growing amount of the producer hogs that die today are tied to the cutout itself, as an industry, by my estimates, already close to 60% of the hogs that die currently have the pork cutout as the primary determinant of their value. So in fact, whether the industry knows it or not, the cutout is already the most important price metric on the marketing side, and it's time the industry, in my mind, officially recognizes this fact. So as I mentioned earlier, and Mark certainly drove home with the risk management slide he showed in terms of how important it was to the P&L producers so far this year. Risk management and access to independent capital are key parts of allowing this producer community to remain independent. Recently, there's been an increasing amount of speculation and discussion around the industry that the CME is in the process of putting together and listing a contract that is going to be tied to the pork cutout. Specifically, the contract will be tied to the daily USDA mandatory cutout report. It's the LMPK 602. I've got a link there that takes anyone who cares to that report. That shows where anyone can get more information if they desire. Again, I don't know that this is going to happen. Again, like I said, that there's been a significant amount of speculation and discussion around it. It's certainly something I hope will happen. It will become a key part of supporting the cutout becoming the primary mode for price discovery that I think it needs to. And so we'll just see how that progresses. But importantly, the listing of the contract to me strengthens the case for adopting the cutout as the market for price discovery in today's industry. To me, the fact that we're even talking about it is in and of itself a reflection of two things. Number one, how poor the negotiated hog market has become, but number two, how important the cutout already is in terms of a price metric setting the value that represents the hogs that we process in this country today. The current CME index, lean hog index, increasingly struggles to be a useful tool, as I see it, for today's industry for two primary reasons. Number one, It is still largely tied to a market, that being the negotiated hog market, that, as I pointed out earlier, no longer is liquid enough to provide accurate prices for the industry. But importantly, number two, the hog index, current CME lean hog index, lacks transparency, as a growing but importantly uncertain amount of the index is tied to the pork cutout. The second issue with regards to transparency can clearly be seen in terms of the divergence here recently between the negotiated hog prices, which is the blue line, and the actual CME index itself. Historically, up until the last 4 or 5 years, this correlation has been almost perfectly. And starting in late 15 and really progressively getting worse until we basically had a huge separation in these two in the early part of this year. The issue is even more clear when one looks at the growing divergence between the two mandatory price reporting categories that comprise the CME index, which is, again, the negotiated market, and then the swine and pork formula. If we move on to the next slide, if we look at a blow-up of this relationship, clearly the divergence in these two categories was made worse this year by the COVID-related plant shutdowns. But I think importantly, the divergence in these two series were well underway prior to those shutdowns. I mean, we can go back into 2019 and clearly see that there were divergences not only in direction, but an increasing gap was opening up between these two components of the CME index, CME lean hog index. These issues have been in place for some time, but like the issues with the negotiated hog market, the problem has become much worse recently for two primary reasons. First, as this chart shows, and again, Mark had this chart in his presentation, historically, there has been a relatively strong correlation between hog prices and pork cutout values. However, in 2015, we can clearly see that the correlation began to break down as increasingly becoming less strong. The second problem, as I said earlier, is that a growing but importantly uncertain amount of the formula pigs that are priced off the cutout are finding their way into the CME lean hog index. Excuse me. While the transition to the number of hogs priced off the cutout has been growing for some time, the fact that we had a growing percentage of them tied to the cutout, but an uncertain amount of them, really was not a problem because we had a strong correlation between the cutout and the hog price. So in a sense, that transition was being masked by that strong correlation. However, since 2015, with the breakdown in that correlation, it has meant that the relationship between the two main components that make up the CME index has become less reliable, and therefore the transparency about really what the CME lean hog index represents in terms of a risk management tool or a price discovery mechanism has become very murky, and it presents a huge challenge for the industry. The bottom line to me is this, is that an increasing lack of correlation between the hog price and cutout values, and more importantly, the lack of transparency in the composition of the two main components of the CME lean hog index has significantly reduced its value as a risk management tool, and is going to continue to do so as we move forward. So in summary, I'd just like to sum things up, and then we'll open up for questions. The negotiated hog market can no longer be relied on to provide price discovery in today's hog and pork industry. This issue has been a growing issue for the swine industry for a long time. And while there have been endless calls and futile attempts to reverse the trend in the negotiated hog trade, recent developments dating back to the middle part of last year, getting worse into this year, indicate that in all likelihood we've reached the point of no return for that market. Number two, price discovery and/or a benchmark price is necessary if the industry is going to remain populated by independent producers. Look, we need a price discovery and a common measure of value. Without no common measure of value, it leaves the industry going in too many directions and never allows it to speak with one voice around issues related to livestock marketing. I mean, you have producers in 2020 that have their marketing agreements tied to the negotiated market that are $30+ different from the producers that are marketing their hogs off of the cutout market. What's in the best interest of those two producers is radically different. We need to have a price that represents more common value so the industry can continue to speak with one voice around issues that are going to continue to face it on the marketing side of things. The negotiated pork cutout is the logical market where price discovery occurs in today's hog and pork industry. Again, by my math, in excess of 60% of the barrels and gilts that die in today's industry are already using the cutout to determine their value. And this number is only likely to grow. Finally, the negotiated pork cutout and hopefully a CME contract based on it should be adopted as a dominant benchmark and risk management tool in today's hog and pork industry. Look, I understand that the negotiated cutout is not perfect, and I'm very fond of a saying that the enemy of better is perfect. There are going to be those that will point out that the cutout doesn't reflect true value of products sold because it doesn't include forward sales, it doesn't include exports or formula. That's all true. But that said, it is vastly superior in terms of liquidity relative to the negotiated hog market, and frankly speaking, is all we have. The cutout and a futures contract tied to it will provide meaningfully more transparent, consistent, and valuable information of what the true value of the livestock the industry is producing today. So again, I'll stop there, and thank you, John, for having me today. And I'd be glad to answer any questions or address any concerns. And if there's anything Mark mentioned that I might be willing to comment on, some things around the chicken industry and what's going on there, I'd be glad to do that as well. So I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thanks very much, Bill. And you gave us a lot to think about. I remember growing up on the family hog farm, and the 2 moments of silence at lunch were for grace at noon and for the hog price at 12:15. It's such a price discovery is such an essential part of how we have operated within the hog industry, within the model that we've chosen to pursue. A first question that comes forward is, why don't we discuss it more? It seems to be a subject that is sort of in hushed tones, and there was some question on whether or not we should even discuss it in this conference. What do you think is the inhibition in the market at this point?
Yeah, well, I mean, so that's a good question, and you know, Mark touched a little on this. That you know, there's a lot of things the U.S. industry does well, and frankly speaking, better than any other industry, pork industry in the world. I mean, we spend a lot of time here studying, you know, the different pork sectors around the world, and the U.S. Let's face it. I mean, we are the preeminent producer of pork from an economic standpoint, right? And so the industry, as we were in a growth phase, you know, dating back to some of the transitions that Mark touched on, you know, from the open barns to, you know, predominantly a domestic industry to now an industry that the marginal pound is being sold in the export market. The industry has had a number of challenges that frankly speaking, some would argue preempted the need to worry too much about marketing. I'd argue that the industry has now reached a level of maturity that it can no longer ignore the marketing side of things. I'd say that's point number one. But I think to answer your question succinctly is that that answer probably goes back to the 1998, 1999 episode in the hog industry, where shackle space became the preeminent problem and really altered the trajectory of the industry. Mark mentioned Wendell Murphy. Certainly the Smithfield system was born out of those problems, and I think there was a level of change in direction about the way the industry viewed itself. Is that, look, if I can lock up shackle space and make sure I'm the low cost producer, I'll survive just about anything. And I think that was the primary driver of why marketing or price discovery, and they go hand in hand, really have been neglected in terms of the industry's focus for so long.
Thanks. There's a question that goes along with Mark's discussion on the limitations of further processing. Is there a danger in that cutout values will be restricted by the abilities of further processing in the market? Yeah,
so I'd actually argue that in the very short run, some of that lack of processing capability in some of the primals is actually contributing to part of the strength in the cutout. I mean, obviously, as we move forward and the hams become, hams are a very seasonal item. As we move into the key ham consumptive time of the year, the inability of processing bone-in hams into a commodity boneless hams that the industry, the consumptive industry values, actually in some respects can be a supportive influence. Look, we never want an industry at the processing side to be hamstrung if you're the producer community. I do think those concerns are legitimate, particularly if we have another COVID-related, plant capacity problems this fall. It's not a forecast, but it's certainly, again, I'll strengthen Mark's views on this. It's certainly a possibility that can't be ignored. To answer your question, yeah, of course that could be a problem. I would argue, however, that is a short-run problem, and really, in my mind, shouldn't detract from the longer-run merits. And really, again, I think I don't want to stand here and say that the cutout is a perfect measure of value. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am strongly suggesting is the negotiated hog market is definitely an imperfect measure of value. And so, my message today is again, to use the phrase, the enemy of better is perfect. I appreciate that the cutout is not a perfect measure for the industry, but I think importantly, the message, I guess, when I was asked to do this, I think I shared with you, John, that I was going to be very, very, direct. And the negotiated hog market is broken. When the USDA can't even release the report, we have to ask ourselves, why is it that we are still pricing a meaningful amount of pigs off of that market, and while we have a risk management tool that is tied to it? So I am sympathetic to some of the concerns around the cutout and as it relates to capacity. But again, I would argue that is a problem, but it doesn't detract from the merits of moving towards a cutout as a central pricing mechanism for this industry.
So the obvious next question from a participant is that you make a very strong argument that the negotiated price should not exist. How do we get rid of it, and what's the impediments to get rid of it? Yeah, so I think, and again, this gets back to, and I don't have any particular insight into the whether the CME is going to follow through on some of the what has clearly been a lot of discussion in the industry about moving towards a contract. If that were to happen, however, we have a unique opportunity. I think the speculative community, which certainly I'm part of, I know in talking to a significant portion of the production community, they actually are like-minded in terms of what's already taking place in the industry. If we have a large business entity like the CME, which is going to, if they do follow through and issue a contract which is in direct competition to their current contract, which is tied to the negotiated market,
At that point, we have a unique quorum between a number of sectors within the industry to speak with one voice to the USDA and the rest of the industry in terms of moving in a direction that does, quote, get rid of, to use your words, the negotiated market. I'm a true believer in where there's a will, there's a way, number one. Clearly, the divergence in prices that the industry is currently realizing in livestock, as I said, presents a serious and fundamental problem in terms of the industry's ability to speak with one voice, right? I mean, there are those that are tied to a metric that is much higher in terms of the value they get for their pigs, that frankly speaking, their interests in a number of ways are at odds with another chunk of the industry. Until we have one common metric for value, the industry is going to speak with a fragmented voice. And I think that really, I think that's a problem that goes beyond just the marketing side of things. And so the answer to whoever asked that question is that I'm hopeful that the CME provides yet another kind of reason for the industry at a number of different sectors to come together and speak with one voice to the USDA about a market that, frankly speaking, the USDA themselves have recognized has an inability to represent an accurate price.
Thanks for that. It seems to me that sometimes we're being driven by metrics that we've created in the past for specific reasons, and we've outgrown their utility. And this may be just a point of evolution in the pork industry.
Well, I would argue to that point, right? I mean, there was a time, long time ago, where the risk management tool. Let's just talk about the evolution of the CME Hog Contract, right? I mean, it used to be a physical delivery. Then it went to a cash settlement, but off of the negotiated market. When the negotiated market got so small, the CME came up with adding two of the mandatory categories together, which was the negotiated plus the swine and pork formula. So to your point, this industry is characterized by an evolutionary change as it relates to what it recognizes as its price discovery / risk management tool. This would be yet another one of those progressions. And while change is sometimes, well, always difficult and will always be met with some opposition, I think it is an objective look at the status of the negotiated market and its ability to serve what is a critical role for any industry characterized by independent producers. We just need a price discovery mechanism. And again, I think that, hey, if the industry is content on a growing percentage of the capacity being in the hands of the packers themselves, well, then we are on our way to being a less independent, more contract grower type model. And if that's the direction the industry wants to go, well, that is fine. But I just think that if that's not the direction that the industry wants to go, well, then by definition, we need a measure of value that people can agree on as they transact in the livestock market.
Seems to me we speak of a cohesive industry with one voice, and yet we have various participants feeling different parts of the elephant or experiencing different pressures from different aspects of that elephant. And it seems that whether we discuss supply management or price discovery, which both have different pressures on price, we are talking about values of the industry and expected structures going into the future. And how much of this is a social decision rather than a passive decision for the industry, and I think for a broader agricultural community. Long question, but I guess the question is, do you have any suggestions for making those decisions rather than being passive?
Yeah. Look, I will argue that whether it's the NPPC, the Pork Board, The industry has, and look, I mean, a conference like this conference, the industry has people that represent them, in my opinion, in a number of ways, in a very good fashion. I think what the industry lacks, again, to me, is a complacency around if it's not broke, don't fix it. I think Mark touched on the industry, and I don't want to get too far afield of the price discovery discussion that you asked, but I mean, Mark's right. Mature industries need to view themselves differently than growing industries. And when we are dependent on the export market for 25% plus of our production, and an increasing percentage of those exports are concentrated into one or two countries, I mean, we have to ask ourselves whether we are not in a mature market, right? And so once we recognize that we are at a mature market as opposed to a growing market, I think we need to, at that point, look at ourselves and say, well, what should change now that we are in a mature market as opposed to a growing market? I mean, growing companies don't always do the same things that mature companies do. And so I'm not here to tell the industry that in fact they are at a mature state and that requires a different set of lenses in which they view themselves and the actions they take and et cetera. But I do think that my belief is one, and again, Mark certainly represents a large portion of the industry, which is capital access. I think that I think it's time that on a number of fronts, again, it was Mark's point, not mine. I mean, the industry, by no fault of their own, was dealt a bit of a black eye around the whole supply chain management deal, right? I mean, what kind of operation are you all running that we have empty shelves, but we have to euthanize animals? I mean, is that the sign of a healthy, prosperous industry? I mean, to a layman, those are the kind of questions that certainly, people asked me. I don't know whether I'm answering your question, but I think as an industry, the way I view the industry going forward is it's just 20 and 30-year-olds act differently than 50 and 60-year-olds. And I'm not saying this industry is on the verge of going over the hill. That's not what I mean by that analogy. But I just mean, what I do mean is that an industry that's characterized, I think Mark used, I think he said that 40% account for 70% of production. That's a mature industry, right? I mean, that is an industry that has it's concentrated enough to where it can get together with one voice and speak to a number of these issues, and I think has an opportunity now, and sometimes challenges can be the best opportunity, and we're probably at one of those points right now.
Well, thanks very much for this, Bill. As I said at the beginning, you've been involved in this industry and contributed to it in many ways. And this description that you gave and the challenges that you gave to this industry are needed. And we thank you for the contributions to this layman conference.
Well, again, I'll just end it by I want to thank Mark for, his words. And I want to thank you all for, as I said earlier, this conference and others like it are a vital forum for discussing these type of issues. And I know this is a difficult time, and there were challenges around putting it together. So you're to be commended, you and everyone who stand behind you for getting this done. So thank you for having me, and all the best.
Thanks very much, Bill. We're going to end this morning's first session with an introduction to our Science and Practice Award. This year, as every year at the Layman Conference, we identify someone who is a practitioner that exemplifies the application of science in his or her work. This year, we're recognizing Dr. Clayton Johnson. Much can and will be said at tonight's Zoetis virtual Layman Science and Practice celebration, and that starts at 5:15. We would just like to share this video to give you an introduction to this year's awardee. And thank you very much for your attention this morning.